do other things. Seemed like it had been a good job. There had an academic from one of the Bogota universities wrote a short book on the project, and she said that the scenarios or the process had changed the individuals and their relationships, but had not had an impact on the larger system. And I thought, well, that's the way it goes. And had you asked me, or when I wrote about it 5 years ago in Solving Tough Problems, I mentioned these dynamics within the team, but I didn't think, and wrote that I didn't think that there had been much impact beyond that. I went back to Colombia 10 years after the scenario project had finished in 2007. There was a big group of people working on different national problems, a dialogue group, a couple of hundred people. And I was really surprised that they kept referring to this project, which was called Destino Colombia, Destination Colombia, and in particular to the fourth story, Unity Makes Strength. And that somehow, the impression I had is that somehow the stories, the water had seeped into the ground and something had happened underground, at least invisible to me and invisible to other people outside the country. There was a UN study on the project. The title of the study was A Treasure Still to be Discovered. So there was something that had happened underground. But what really surprised me is I had lunch on that trip in 2007 with one of Colombia's most brilliant politicians and intellectuals. You may have heard of him. His name's Antanas Mocas. He was twice the mayor of Bogota, just a brilliant social innovation thinker, creative person, revolutionary. And I was amazed at the lunchtime conversation. He said, "Adam, these four stories, I need to talk to you about them. You know, we had the first story. We had the first story of Tomorrow Will Come and We'll See. And then we had, that was under the government of Pastrana. And then we had, sorry, under the government of Samper. Then we had President Pastrana, and he spent his whole term trying to negotiate with the guerrillas. So that was a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Then, out of disappointment with that, the Uribe was elected with a mano duro policy, that we had to crush the guerrillas. The way he was elected was exactly as in the text of the scenarios, and this is the scenario we're dealing with now in 2007, not a peace scenario, but a pacification scenario. And what Mocas wanted to know is, Adam, I've read it very carefully, but there's the text between the third and fourth scenario is there seems to be like a missing page or something. How do you get from everybody march to in unity makes strength? And at first I thought he was kidding. I said, you know, these was just scenarios, you know, just stories about what could happen. It wasn't a forecast or anything. He said, no, seriously. I need to know the real story because we're trying to get in unity make strength. And well, anyhow, this story about the way in which Colombia had been systematically working its way through the four stories was widely told, at least among the political elite. I didn't know what to make of it. Anyhow, the last chapter in the story is February of this year. I went to Bogota again because we were releasing the Spanish edition of the book that you were supposed to get tonight but aren't, Power and Love. And the introduction to the book, the Spanish edition of the book was written by, or is written by, this little-known politician who had organized the first meeting in 1996, Juan Manuel Santos, who is now the president of Colombia. And I was very happy that he'd agreed to write the introduction to the book, and I was really interested in what he would say about the book. To my surprise, he spent the whole speech talking about Destino Colombia. And I want to just read you 2 paragraphs from the speech in February. He said, "It is truly breathtaking to read the Destino Colombia scenarios now because they seem more prophetic than academic. The first scenario, When the Sun Rises We'll See, invited us to think about what would happen if, instead of making a timely intervention, Colombians left the country's problems to resolve themselves, which led to a loss of state authority, upsurge of violence, territorial fragmentation, and a dramatic increase in poverty and social inequality. The second scenario, A Bird in the Hand is Worth Two in the Bush, alluded to concessions being offered to the armed groups to start to rebuild democracy and to stop, at all costs, the increasing cycle of death and violence. Today, as we mark 10 years since the end of those major negotiations, we know that the scenario was attempted but failed. This resulted in some of the characteristics of the third scenario, Forward March, in which the political leadership acts on the popular demand to restore security. Faced with such clear evidence, who can deny the prophetic gifts of those who met at Kirama? In Colombia, we have now embarked on an irreversible evolutionary process that we hope will culminate in the peaceful transition and the final reconsolidation of the fourth scenario, In Unity Lies Strength. That scenario is the way forward that we want to realize today with the national unity proposal that my government has launched. It is good to know that the best scenario that we imagined 16 years ago is now beginning to be realized. I was very surprised. I told the story about this surprising speech of the President of Colombia to my old friend Betty Sue Flowers, this poet who's been working on scenarios. She's best known for having worked on that series, The Power of Myth, editing the famous television series about Joseph Campbell. And I said, how do you understand this mythically? How do you understand the power of stories? And what she said is, scenarios can mutate into empowering myths. Myths give us courage. If it is already true in the story, then paradoxically, we can make it happen. And the final piece of this story is, I also met on that trip in February with one of the guerrillas who had been on the other end of the phone those 9 days, who I'd never seen physically, but he's since gotten out of prison. Gives you his name is Francisco Galan. He at least gave me the impression of somebody who knew a thing or two about life. And he said 2 things to me. He said, I have learned that it is more difficult to make peace than to make war. And the second thing he said is, if we keep repeating the same stories about our country, then we will keep doing the same things which do not work. But we are addicted to this repetition. We need to get fed up with these same stories. We need new stories. So, that's the story I wanted to tell you. And if I come back then to the question I posed at the outset, which is what is the nature of the relationship between our reality and the stories we tell about our reality, I think that the moral of my story is that we are accustomed to thinking about our stories as reflecting reality or being shaped by reality, and that's true, but I think it's equally true that our stories shape our reality. And therefore, we really have to ask questions about, or as we say in South Africa, interrogate. We really have to interrogate our stories. And there are 2 distinctions about our stories that are crucial. Do we have stories which keep us apart, or do we have stories that keep us together? This, parenthetically, is the relationship between power and love. Power, the story about us, and me and us, and what we're doing and what we need to do. The whole in itself, and love, the way in which our whole is part of a larger whole. And how are these 2 related? So the first distinction is, to what extent are we telling stories that keep us apart, and to what extent are we telling stories that bring us together. And the second distinction is to what extent are the stories we're telling keeping us stuck, and to what extent are the stories we're telling helping us move forward. And the more I have done this work, the more I think this shift, not between being confused and knowing the answer, but between being stuck and making movement, is the key distinction. And therefore this question about, are the stories we're telling keeping us stuck, or are the stories we're telling allowing us to move forward, is crucial. There's a very famous story about this in the strategic planning literature. It's the story about a group of soldiers who were on exercises in the Alps, and they were lost. It was snowing. They didn't know where they were. They stopped. They started to get cold, give up hope. And one of the soldiers was rooting around in his bag, and he found a map. And they had the map, and they looked at it, and they moved forward, and they made it out of the mountains and down to a warm hut, and they survived. And then when they looked at the map, they found it wasn't a map of the Alps, it was a map of the Pyrenees. And the significance of this story in the strategy literature is that it's the key thing is to move, and to be alert, and to be looking, and to be hopeful, and to be moving. So, I'd like to end with the following. So, the conclusion I reach from the riddle which Susan posed me is that our stories contribute to shaping our reality. And this leaves us with very, I think, quite straightforward practical questions for those of us who are interested in social change, in changing reality, in social innovation. Practical questions. And I'll just mention three. The first question is, how can we become aware of the stories we're telling? I've always loved this image of suspending our assumptions, or suspending our thinking, or suspending our stories. This image that we take the stories we're telling and we hang them as if on a string in front of ourselves, so that we can see, oh, this is the story I'm telling. You can see, oh, this is the story Adam's telling. We can talk about it, we can interrogate it, we can criticize it, and we can review it. And maybe at the end I'll say, yes, that is the story. Or maybe I will say, no, I think this story is not working, or not right, or not helpful. So the first question is, how can we become aware of or suspend the stories we're telling about reality? The second, I think, more difficult question is, how can we become aware of the way in which the stories we are telling are producing or reproducing the reality around us? And this is a challenging question, because often when we investigate that question, we find that the stories we're telling are reproducing the reality that we say we don't want. And the third practical question is, how can we change our stories and thereby change our realities? How can we change them individually? How can we change them in teams and organizations and communities? And I think most importantly, but most challengingly, how can we change the stories in our society, in our culture? And what is the role of cultural agents or cultural activities in shifting the stories we're all telling about our reality, and thereby in shifting our reality? So these are the questions I'm working on, and that you may also want to work on, and that I'm looking forward to discussing with you now. Thank you very much.